Hello and no, no. Hello and welcome to another episode, this time with Becca Strober. My name is Josef Mühlbauer. I'm a scientific researcher at Empowerment for Peace, a small NGO that is dedicated to critical peace studies. Today I have the great honor and privilege of talking to Becca Strober. Becca studied political communication, sociology and anthropology in Tel Aviv, Israel. Becca worked for various NGOs in the field of refugees, international relations, and Arab-Jewish youth partnerships. Becca was for many years the senior director of Breaking the Silence, an organization of veteran soldiers who have served in the Israeli military since the Second Intifada, initiated, if I remember correctly, by Jehuda Schaul. Becca has been leading tours in Hebron for many years as part of her effort to get the world to see the reality on the ground. And I totally recommend visiting the website of Breaking the Silence, and I totally recommend visiting and subscribing to Becca's social media challenge. There she puts a lot of information out there. And also I want to mention one can book Becca for lectures and tours and webinars. So this is especially useful for journalists, NGOs and politicians and so on. So I totally recommend booking Becca. Yes, and last but not least, I also recommend you have a new YouTube channel. So feel free, everybody, to subscribe to Becca Explains the Occupation. So dear Becca, it's really a great honor that you followed my invitation, and it's amazing to have you on this program.
Thanks so much for having me, Josef. I'm excited to be here.
Let us start with your knowledge as an Israeli citizen. You live there, so you have a lot of experience. You talk to IDF soldiers, you talk to many Arab people and many others, so you have a lot of knowledge and experience. How would you describe your daily work? And yeah, let's begin from here, maybe.
Yeah. So I would say that kind of daily work, I would say the main thing that I personally invest in is education. Education of Israelis, especially, and also education of the global community and also Jewish communities abroad, Jewish communities outside of Israel. And I would say that a lot of my daily work is a combination of trying to bring in some of the reality of what the 1967 occupation looks like. What does military control mean on a daily basis? And if you follow my Instagram page, Becca Explains the Occupation, or any page I have, actually, a podcast and my YouTube, it's all the same name to keep it simple. Kind of goes into the details of, well, but what does military control actually mean? Because I think a lot of people assume when it comes to the 1967 occupation, especially in the West Bank, for example, I think there's a lot of assumption that the Israeli army is kind of passive unless there's a specific need to intervene. And the reality is kind of the exact opposite of that. It's 180 degrees different than that, which is the Israeli army is constantly intervening to kind of make sure that Palestinians can't live completely normal lives free of our control, because we want to make sure our control is felt. I say we, I mean Israel, I mean Israeli soldiers, I mean the army, the state as a whole, so that they'll be too afraid basically to kind of rise up against this control, right? Now, rising up could be violent, though it's often also nonviolent. I mean, it includes things like student bodies or nonviolent protests. And so a lot of what I do is to try and bring that reality to people. And I think the other thing that I try and do as an educator is bring into the conversation kind of understanding and the emotional conversation that I think is necessary to have, especially with Israelis and Jewish communities abroad. There's a really big feeling amongst Israelis that the reality that we live in is zero sum. And I also grew up believing that, meaning that either Israelis can be safe, Jewish Israelis can be safe, or Palestinians can be safe. And I don't think just bringing dry information is enough to show otherwise. It's important, it's helpful. But it also has to come with this conversation of how dangerous the zero sum reality is, either we can be safe or they can be safe, and how it's actually harmful to all of us, but also giving space then for people's fears, for people's questions, for people's uncertainty. And I think that's a lot of what's missing often in this conversation with my communities.
Very interesting. And how does the majority of Israeli population look at the situation in Gaza or in the West Bank or in Hebron? Because the question arises, why is your work so important? Why do you feel is education so important? Why is especially also Israeli citizens to educate? Why is it important in your opinion?
Yeah. So I would say that the reality is such is that there is a whole entire effort system that is put on us as Jewish Israelis to try and get us to not know actually what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank. The past year in Gaza, the atrocities that are happening in Gaza, including the ones that we're doing, right? Of course, there's also Hamas, but there's also us. We're not seeing that. We're not seeing it on TV. We're not hearing Palestinian stories in Gaza. We do see on TV pictures of destruction, and it's kind of shown as a as a good thing. Look how much we've succeeded. Look how much we've destroyed, right? But we're not seeing um, the children who have lost limbs, the mothers who have lost their children, the fathers who have been separated from their families, the bodies under the rubble. We aren't seeing those things. And in the West Bank, in which the situation is, of course, not as dramatic as it is in Gaza, but in which the violence is quite daily, we are not seeing the reality in which, for example, how much settlement expansion and settler violence is not only adding more Jewish Israelis to the West Bank as settlers, but is actually harming Palestinian communities and even taking away Palestinian communities, cleansing Palestinian communities, right? We're at almost 30 communities that have been partially or fully cleansed since the beginning of the war in the West Bank. And I see this as a very purposeful, effort of the state to try and get us to not know, because it deepens that zero sum. If no one knows, right? If we have no idea that we have any level of military control over Gaza or over the West Bank, then there's a much stronger ability to live in the narrative that Palestinians just hate us because we're Jews, right? Now, I'm not saying that there's not a single person that thinks that, right? I'm not saying that doesn't exist at all. But I think the crux of the issue and the crux of the violence that we're seeing is due to very real injustice that exists. That doesn't mean that every measure of dealing with that injustice is legitimate, right? Hamas's choice to murder civilians on October 7th was completely not legitimate, right? But overwhelmingly, I think we often view that violence as nothing was like there was nothing going on in the West Bank, for example, at all. And then all of a sudden you have terror attacks, right? And that's really only one part of the picture. On a much, if we zoom out, we can see, well, yeah, but in these same areas, a lot of these where there tends to be more violence, there also tends to be more new settlements and outposts. And that also requires both settler violence, right, which is violence of civilians, Israeli civilians against Palestinian civilians, in which the army is there backing up Israeli settlers exclusively. And it also involves military violence, right? I mean, my job as a soldier once upon a time was to guard a settlement and make sure that no Palestinians approached the settlement, even though it was quite clear from the landscape that a lot of the area we were talking about approaching was actually their private land, was land belonging to a Palestinian village nearby, right? So when we're not seeing those realities, it makes it a lot easier to actually feel like this reality is zero sum. And I want us to move towards peace, but also towards justice and equality. There are two people on this land. We're going to share that land. Right now, we're not exactly sharing it. We're both here, but we're not sharing it. How do we move from a place of zero sum to shared power, to shared existence, right? I think a part of that, I think, is most important for Jewish Israelis is that we need to recognize that there's actually Palestinian existence here, right? A lot of times we first and foremost, I bring groups to speak with Palestinians in Hebron and in the South Hebron Hills and Jerusalem, a bunch of other places. A lot of the questions of young Israelis, first and foremost, is, do you recognize Israel's right to exist? And I think when you peel the layers behind that question, some of them I think are genuinely asking about the state of Israel as it stands today. But I think what they're really asking is, do you recognize my right to be here as I have since I was born? Right? And that's the exact same thing, you know, when Palestinians come and ask us that same question, do we have a right to be here? For the most part in 2024, unfortunately, that's not a given in the minds of Jewish Israelis. And it's not because we're bad. It's not because we're evil. It's because we've been taught a zero-sum reality in which we've basically been taught by the media, by our schools, by the way we think in the military, that Palestinian existence is a threat to us, right? And so that's why I think it's so important to do education with Israelis, and also with Jewish communities, and also I think around the world. You know, I've been surprised since October 7th, and I started this Instagram page, how many people are not Jewish but have kind of learned a similar narrative. You know, I've always kind of known that in the United States, it's very common for Christian evangelicals to hear a lot of the kind of a narrative very similar to what Israelis are raised with. Also, Germans. There's like a lot of Germans who follow my page. And so I think it's the option to expand and see that the situation is not zero sum, and zero sum is inherently dangerous to everyone. And we have a power to change it.
Absolutely interesting to hear this perspective. In the media, especially in Germany and Austria, because you mentioned that many German followers that you have, media, especially in Germany and Austria, portrayed or framed this story like you get the impression that everything started from 7th October. And
Right.
there was no history, no context, no occupation, and yeah, no settler violence, and that everything began with the 7th October. In the Austrian and German case, I believe they did it with a good intention, because we have a historical obligation, and because of the Shoah and so on and so forth. So of course
Right.
there is this so-called Staatsräson. So I believe our politicians mean it in a good manner, in good faith. But maybe this is why many German followers that you have. People want to know the other story
Yeah.
as well, and the context, the history, the complexity, and maybe they are hungry for the other
Yeah.
perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's also, you know, I hope and I regularly encourage people who follow me to also follow Palestinian voices. Like, I'm not a replacement for Palestinian voices. But I do think it's interesting for people to hear other Israeli voices, you know. Inside of Israel, a lot of times, one of the main critiques of people who do work similar to the work that I do is, okay, fine, we can have a conversation, but let's not air our dirty laundry outside, right? And one of the things that I always talk to fellow Israelis about on this point is, look, our dirty laundry is out there, right? Like the pictures of soldiers in Gaza, with the destruction, you know, wearing women's lingerie. I mean, really awful stuff. And the quotes of our politicians are out there saying there is no innocent person in Gaza, right? Saying kind of quotes that basically show there is no right for Gazans to exist, that, you know, there's no innocent child in Gaza. That's out there. What I, you know, am doing partially is bringing another perspective of Israelis, of an Israeli, who is looking to find a path forward that does not involve the unsafety or the active harm of Palestinians who are living here beside me, you know, and I can appreciate so many Jewish people came to Israel following the Holocaust. My family did not. My family was in Jerusalem already for hundreds of years. which is fairly unique. There weren't that many of us, but there was always Jewish presence in the land. But really, a lot of people came over as refugees at a time when I think Europe didn't want, the Holocaust had just ended, and Europe didn't want us. And at the same time, America had closed its doors, and I think Israel really was the only place for a lot of people to go. And I think also after the Holocaust, there was a real feeling of actually we want self-determination. It didn't start with the Holocaust, but it did start with pogroms. It started with a lot of violence towards Jewish people in Europe. And the response was, okay, so we have to be able to self-determine. We have to have our own state. And, I can really appreciate that. And I feel that as part of my collective story, despite my personal family not being in the Holocaust. And at the same time, then I think it makes it so much more important that we not also then put systematic violence on Palestinians who are also just trying to exist in the land that they come from, that they lived for hundreds, thousands of years in their villages and their cities. We have to be able to find a way forward. The problem is not, I think, the two populations living there. The problem is the state structures that, again, bring us to this zero-sum game in which one state, the state of Israel, has full legitimate use of power, and Palestinians have actually no legitimate use of power, even for defense, right? I mean, there's absolutely nothing that any Palestinian, including the Palestinian Authority, can do if the army unjustly comes into their house into Ramallah, or if settlers are violently attacking people somewhere in the West Bank. There's actually nothing that a Palestinian can do to legitimately defend themselves in the eyes of the state of Israel. Right? It's basically on the Israeli army to give that defense, but the Israeli army is not giving the defense. They're participating in a lot of these actions. And so we have to be able to come up with a new vision and movement forward that actually allows us to share this place and share power and to recognize the existence of the other, even before we're talking about coexistence. And I believe in coexistence, I believe in shared society, but first and foremost, I think we need to be able to just recognize each other's existence. And I think on our part as Israelis, that's a very big task ahead of us.
And of course, you are doing it because you love Israel and you want to be safe there and you want to coexist with other ethnic minorities or majorities in peace, I assume. So
yeah, I mean, I love Israelis. Like, I love my society.
Yeah.
I love look, I think it's always a question of like, do you love Israel? I think it's a difficult question, because what is Israel? If we're talking about the people, of course. If I'm talking about kind of our collective right to exist there because we exist there, of course. But also just culturally, I love a lot of things about my culture. I love that we do, that it's very kind of a communal experience to do Shabbat dinner on Friday nights. And I love the culture that comes with living next to the sea. And I love how we do holidays, and I love Hebrew. I love Hebrew literature. All of those things I love dearly. They're very, very close to me. I think I think we need to remember that states, regimes don't have rights. People have rights. And I think that's where we need to often refocus the framing of this conversation to make sure that we are building the most amount of rights for the most amount of people with a clear demand for equality. It can include collective equality, right? Self-determination for Jewish Israelis and self-determination for Palestinians, but then we both deserve it. And I think that's, of course, this is I engage in this out of a place of love and connection, of course.
Let's move to my next question is how does the occupation and the military presence affect daily life? You had a wonderful conversation with the Palestinian activist Mohamed Kafesha. I hope I
Mohamed Kafesha.
yeah, yes.
Yeah.
On your YouTube channel, and I listened to the conversation. And so maybe you can sum up what was his impression. What does it look like? Is there a huge huge wall? Are there checkpoints? What does it
Yeah.
feel on a daily life?
Yeah. So again, I don't think I can, I obviously can't speak for Mohanad for how he experiences it, but from our perspective, a lot of what we try and ensure the daily life in the West Bank. And I say we, I mean the Israeli army. I say it as a former soldier who served there, but also I kind of mean the army as a thinking is, I think we need to understand that in the West Bank today, there are around 3 million Palestinians. There's around 500,000 Israeli settlers, right? That does not include East Jerusalem, by the way. Then the number's about 750,000. But in the West Bank, the part that's under direct military control. And there are somewhere probably around 20,000 soldiers in any given moment in the West Bank. Those numbers decrease sometimes, they increase. But even if they were to jump to 40,000, there are many, many, many more Palestinians in the West Bank than there are Israeli soldiers. And because the army is not really in charge of the mission to occupy, to have a military occupation, right? That's a decision of the government since 1967 to uphold a military occupation in the West Bank. And that means that instead of there being clear-cut laws that are voted on in a parliament, instead of that, what you have is kind of you have military orders that the military puts out. And what we see is that because the government basically tells the army what its mission is, and its mission is to control, make sure that the West Bank maintains order, make sure that, there's not a Palestinian uprising, make sure that daily life can go on. That's the first mission that kind of sets what does daily life under occupation look like. The second, and this makes it much more complex, is but also protect all of the 500,000 Israelis that are living in the West Bank, while you don't just maintain order and make sure Palestinians are maintaining order under a military government, which is in and of itself difficult over time, right? People want self-determination, people want rights, people want to be able to vote for their own candidates in a democracy. Even if they don't have a democracy, they want to feel that or know that the person who is leading them has their best interest in mind. Military occupation inherently does not include any of that. And so it's already difficult. And then the government has this added project, which is and ensure pretty much exclusively the safety and rights of settlers, right? And so the reality of how the day-to-day in the West Bank looks is a combination of soldiers mainly guarding settlers, guarding settlements, making Israeli settlers feel safe, right? Even if it's not complete real safety, a feeling of safety, right? And we can do this by putting soldiers out on the roads where settlers drive and things like that to kind of give this air of a feeling of safety. And the other thing that we do is we try and make sure that Palestinians feel our presence, right? And so again, so that they'll be too afraid to kind of lift their heads up. But the idea is, since we're so because Israeli soldiers are so few and they are so many, the idea is, well, we can't actually be everywhere at the same time. So let's just try and give a feeling of Palestinians will never quite know when we'll show up, how long we'll show up for, right? And so on an average day, it could mean setting up, there's obviously checkpoints in the West Bank, but also setting up checkposts, which are temporary. At night, it could mean going into people's houses, even if they're innocent, even if we don't have any, information on them or believe that they're connected to any kind of violence or terror. And make sure that Palestinians are staying away from settlements, right? Even if those settlements are actually built on their private land and right next to the settlement is their private land, Palestinians still need to get coordination from the army in order to be able to go to those areas. And so that's what a lot of the daily life looks like. I think when people think about the occupation, you asked about the wall, they mainly think about the wall and checkpoints, right? That's kind of the image that comes up. But I would say that actually most of the walls, most of the barriers, you can't see them with your eyes, right? They're not physical barriers exactly, but they are barriers that prevent movement for Palestinians, right? So for example, you have this settlement called Kadum, and next to it, Kadumim, it was a settlement called Kadumim. And next to it, not far away, 500 meters, you have a Palestinian village called Kadum. And in the early 2000s, Kadumim expanded to right next to the Palestinian village. The expanded section is near the Palestinian village. And now when Palestinians drive on the main road to go to Nablus, which is the nearest city, it's like a 5-minute, 10-minute drive, they get really close to the expanded section of Kadumim. And so the Israeli army said, well, that's inherently dangerous for the settlement of Kadumim, and have not allowed Palestinians to drive down that road since. And so instead, Palestinians need to take this kind of circuitous, this like long route to Nablus that can easily take 40, 45 minutes. In the meantime, they might meet a military checkpost, right? Kind of just like on the road that soldiers put up, and then kind of have to, that takes longer. It's not exactly something that you can quite see. If you're standing in Kadumim, you might not know that that's the reality. But for Palestinians, these are very real, concrete ways in which military control is constantly felt. And a big part of it is not knowing how, when, or where, or if you'll feel that control today, right? So again, like some days you could leave for work, and let's say it takes 15 minutes to get to your job. And it really could take 15 minutes that day, but you'll never know when you're leaving for work if it's actually going to take 15 minutes. And I think for those of us who, live in the world and work in an office, imagine just never knowing how long it's going to take to get to work. That's a kind of crazy development. Like that's a crazy reality to live in. And so I can't quite explain it from the perspective of Palestinians. That's not my role. That's not my experience. But I can say that from our perspective, a large part of it is to maintain control and indefinitely, because the Israeli government, I used to say, has no plan of leaving the West Bank, right? As far as the army is concerned, it's indefinite. Now we know with the current Israeli government and the past couple of Israeli governments that annexation is very much on the table and is moving forward. And even a lot of legal advisors have now said that because of Smotrich, who is a minister, because of his specific roles over some aspects of the occupation now, that actually we are already talking about de Euro annexation, or we're already talking about legal annexation. And so the military's job basically is to try and maintain order over millions of people that didn't vote for it, that don't want it there, while also trying to protect exclusively Jewish Israelis who are living in settlements. And as I think you can imagine, that creates a very complex system of different levels of daily control, assuming that everything is relatively calm.
Terms and words and theories and concept matters. So because you understand the world better, you understand the big picture, the context, the history. Your name also on social media is using the word occupation. Mm-hmm. So this refers to a historical, concept, I believe. So it didn't start yesterday, and this. Where you wanna start? Where's your starting point? Do you start with the war in 1967 or earlier or after that? What is your starting point from your perspective?
I think it's hard to put one specific starting point on it. I'll say that I personally spend most of my time educating on the 1967 occupation. And when I use the word occupation, I'm talking about the legal framework, which is that the basically temporary sovereign in the West Bank is the Israeli military, right? It's not the only occupation. Russia's occupying parts of Ukraine right now. Ukraine is occupying parts of Russia right now. I think we need to demystify this word. It exists. throughout history, there have been occupations, and throughout modern warfare in history, there have been occupations. And it just means that the control of the land is military control by a foreign military, right? And it has a sets of rules to it. And that's on a daily basis most of what I focus on. And I focus on that mainly because I see it as the area that is the most important to deal with at this moment, because it's so dramatic. Even the daily violence that I just described, if you're the victim of it or if you're living it, is quite dramatic. And I think that also if you're the soldier who's upholding it, I've been there for a few times in the West Bank as a soldier, and it's something that really makes you question, what are we doing and what's right, and am I upholding, already the first time I guarded a settlement, I said, am I upholding the safety of Israelis in Israel, or am I upholding a political decision, right? And I think it's very hard to deny that in the West Bank, a lot of the work that soldiers are doing are also upholding a political decision. So I think there's an urgency there that understanding the 1967 occupation requires. But there's no question that it goes farther back from 1967. And I think even before 1948, a lot of experts like Hillel Cohen, who is a professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, he puts it at 1929, which is when there was not the first, but the first major outbreak of violence between Jews and Muslims, Jews and Palestinians who were living in the country during the British Mandate, as kind of, this became a conflict now between two people that was not going to just easily end, right? And I think there was a lot of reasons for that. A lot of people look on both sides. Like I hear a lot of Israelis saying, "Oh, but there was no occupation in 1929, and Jews were massacred," and that's true. I mean, there was 129 Jews who were killed during those days of fighting, and there was 116 Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians who were killed during that same time period. And you have instances of local Arabs killing Jews. You have instances of local Jews killing Arabs, but you also have a lot of instances of the British police either participating in violence, killing people, or even just standing by idly. And so I think we actually really see a lot of that reality that existed already in 1929. The structure, who has power, who has control, looks different, right? But I think it's not happen chance that we took the legal systems from the British, who in 1929 were also present during this outbreak of violence. And I think there's a lot of how they handled it that also led to where we are today. It's not to put all of the blame on them, but I do think it kind of, we need to look at it expanded in a more expanded way. And I think in general, a lot of times we look at this as some people call it the Arab-Israeli conflict, and they're maybe talking about Arab states that are wider than just Israelis and Palestinians. Some people call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that those are all true, but also from the first moment, the international community was widely involved in this conflict. I mean, the original borders of the state of Israel were decided by the UN. The original borders of what would have become the state of Palestine were decided by the UN. The role of the British and how much power they handed over to pre state Jewish leaders, right? And how much control they did or much less handed over to Palestinian local leaders has an effect on what we're seeing today. And of course, I think we can't deny the reality of 1948. And I often say, even though the Nakba, the catastrophe, which was happening at the same time that Israel was becoming a state during the War of Independence, really was a catastrophe. And I think it was a catastrophe for all of us, the mass displacement. And a lot of times people will talk about it, but the Jordanian army or the Lebanese army or the Egyptian army told Palestinians to leave and then they can go back, right? But then they weren't able to go back. And I think it's less of a question of what brought any individual village to basically leave against their will, right? Because even when you're fleeing a war zone, you don't want to leave. I'm thinking today, now that we're 12 hours into a ceasefire with Lebanon, of all the Israelis who can go back to their home for the first time, who are on the northern border, who can go back to their home for the first time in 13 months, right? Because there was a war, does that mean they don't have a right to go back to their home? I'm thinking of all the Lebanese people who I've seen. There's like traffic jams in Lebanon of people going back to southern Lebanon. Do they not have a right to go back home? Of course they do, right? And so I don't think that the crux of the issue is necessarily under what orders or under what reality people were just forced to leave, but rather the fact that in the new systems that were created, it systematically did not allow those Palestinians to come back. And I don't know what a future will look like, in terms of Palestinian return. I don't know if I think there's going to be massive return. I think that's a very complex project. It scares Jewish Israelis a lot. I think a lot of Palestinians that I've talked to also, some of them want to come home, some of them want to come back, but some of them also just want recognition, So I don't know what it's going to look like. But what I do know is that if we don't deal with the base of this pain and loss, right, then how can we move forward from it and become and find a shared reality in which we can live together? I think that's really important. And it's the same that as a Jewish person, again, it's so crucial that people recognize trauma that we faced as Jews, the violence that we faced, the Holocaust, pogroms, right? So many of the reasons why there was mass migration in the first place in the mid 20th century, right? Where would we be if people just didn't recognize that? And so I think at the same time, in the same way that I demand, and we demand rightfully so, recognition of that, I think we also need to offer recognition and a way forward for people and for families who were in the Nakba, who suffered from the Nakba. And sometimes now it's, third generation, even at this point, fourth generation. But I also know people that it was them. I've sat with 80-year-olds, 90-year-olds. I've heard their stories in the same way that I've sat with 90-year-old Jewish, like my elders who have told us what they went through. And I'm not saying that the two historical moments are exactly the same. I'm not trying to compare what exactly happened there, but I am trying to compare the right to recognition for what happened. And I think the deserving and kind of the need for that. So I don't think, I talk about the occupation in 1967, but of course it goes much farther back, and also includes questions of, well, how did so many Jewish Israelis even come to the land, right? I mean, these are all things that I think a lot of times it's a lot easier to leave out these points because they weaken our narrative. But at the same time, maybe that's okay. It's not that I think either side needs to give up their narrative, definitely not completely. I think narratives have important roles in bringing us together as people and in having a shared identity as part of our peoplehood. I think Jewish people have that. I think Palestinians have that. But also it's okay that we also give space for other people's narratives, and we also give recognition. I think that will build us up much more than it will weaken us or break us down.
Let us show the whole political spectrum and picture. There is, for example, I'm a huge fan, Anarchist Against the Walls, for example. There is also the left-wing politician, I pronounce it very bad, I believe, Ofer Kassif.
You did a pretty good job, Ofer Kassif. Yeah.
And he was excluded in the Knesset, from the Knesset.
Yep.
So we have some sort of left-wing, communist, anarchist, feminist spectrum. And then we have Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and this I'm not sure how to call them, because many of them call them right-wing or right extremists, nationalists. Right. Some even go further and say to them, okay, maybe this is fascism. I'm not sure how to call them and frame them, but let's call them right-wing politicians.
Yeah.
Let's show the whole spectrum in Israel.
Yeah. So I actually just put out a podcast on this like yesterday. So it called Where's the Opposition? And I think that the best way that I have a framework for thinking about Israeli politics is not thinking so much of like right wing, left wing, in which that axis is talking about like more hawkish and more dovish, right? Like if it's dovish, I want peace. If it's hawkish, I care more about security. I think that's a false framing because I think that where we're at right now is the most right wing almost that you can be, and we're not secure, right? I mean, October 7th showed us over and over Israelis are not secure. That idea of security was always an illusion. As long as we're not dealing with the deeper injustices, we're going to also feel insecurity and we're going to live in security. But that's how usually people talk about it. I want to offer another framing, which is that most politicians or most political parties are somewhere along the spectrum of how they view control between the river to the sea. And what I mean by that is, so you have the state of Israel, right, which was founded in 1948, and its borders more or less stabilized in 1949 after ceasefires with Lebanon, with Jordan, with Egypt, with Syria. And then its borders expanded again in 1967, right? Now, technically, the state of Israel is still those borders from 1949, meaning Israel does not have a right to occupy the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, or the Golan Heights, which is part of occupied Syria, right? That's very clear stand on the part of the international community, a very clear stand. However, the reality is, and I care more about talking about reality than we can't talk about legal frameworks if we can't put those legal frameworks into what actually is going on. And the reality is that there's only one state between the river to the sea. It's the state of Israel. And Israel has legitimate, in the eyes of itself and in the eyes of the world, legitimate use of violence everywhere between the river to the sea, right? Even if today there are countries that are saying, no, that's not true. Israel has no right to be in Gaza. Israel has no right to be in the West Bank. Practically, there's not a lot of organized state diplomacy happening around, kind of basically sanctioning or divesting from Israel because Israel functions in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip and has since 1967, right? So Israel has the exclusive legitimacy to means of violence. It has a monopoly on violence between the river to the sea. And I think it's really important that we talk about the monopoly of legitimate violence, because a lot of times this conversation, people want to have this conversation and they want to leave out the fact that Israel actually has a monopoly on legitimate violence. We only want to talk about reactive violence, right? We only want to talk about the violence of Palestinians, like Palestinian terror, Hamas, or any other group. And I think that's not real. That's not what is actually going on here. There's a lot of violence, and in general, we tend to pay attention less to violence that we view in our eyes as legitimate. By the way, that includes internal violence such as police, right? I'm not, when I say the means of violence, it's not that I'm saying that everything is constantly violent, but who are considered legitimate bodies in which they are allowed to employ violence, and it won't kind of, put the international community up in arms. But the Israeli military, absolutely. Hamas, absolutely not, right? And the Palestinian Authority is able to use violence it has a police force. It's able to arrest Palestinians inside Ramallah if they, if there's a car accident or if they killed someone, or, I'm sure there's a million other things that, whatever you arrest people for, right? But it doesn't have the ability to protect Palestinians if the Israeli army is coming into Ramallah and breaking into a house, right? Kind of like I mentioned before. And that's important because most of how you can look at the Israeli political axis is in terms of, do these political parties or do these politicians believe that there's space for only one state one group with a monopoly of legitimate violence between the river to the sea? Overwhelmingly, that answer is yes, right? So the king, like the leader in saying, let's maintain the status quo. We're not going to annex the West Bank. We're not going to annex Gaza, right? But we are also not going to allow for Palestinians to have a defense force, right? We're not going to allow for Palestinians to be an actual independent state. I mean, this is one of the ways that we define states in international relations. The king of this is Netanyahu, right? Netanyahu, one of his main purposes in life has been prohibiting a Palestinian state next to the state of Israel, right? Now, in the last years, he has actually also talked about annexing parts of the West Bank. But before that, he was status quo. But at the same time, you have others to the right of him who are basically pulling him towards annexation. So he's the status quo camp. He's somewhere between status quo camp to now being pulled towards annexation. So is a lot of people in the opposition, right? Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz. They're very clear kind of status quo type political parties. And I think this surprises people, but for the most part, so are Labor. And Meretz is not currently in the Knesset, but also Meretz has kind of moved into status quo, right? The Meretz and Labor have combined into one party today. They're called the Democrats, and they're led by this leader named Yair Golan, who was a former high military commander. And Yair Golan believes in getting rid of settlements in the West Bank, right? But he says, but we need to maintain security control between the river to the sea, right? But in the West Bank, we need to maintain security control, which is basically saying, I want to know that we can barge into that house in Ramallah and no one will stop us and it won't start a war. And we want to maintain that control. By the way, I think what Yair Golan is offering, we'll get rid of settlements, but we'll maintain military control, is the least likely to happen out of any political option that's on the table. So the status quo camp is quite big. And then you have the annexation camp. And the annexation camp is basically saying, you can't maintain things as status quo, let's annex. We want to annex. We want to deepen our control. We want to put sovereignty on the West Bank. There's now, of course, a very strong movement for settlements in Gaza that would also lead to sovereignty in Gaza. And at the most right of this, I would say you have Smotrich and Orit Stuk, and maybe Shikli and a few others, right? Smotrich is probably is the head of is the leader of this camp right now in the Israeli Knesset. Ben Gvir is more right wing in a lot of ways than Smotrich, but I would put Ben Gvir and Lieberman. I would put them both in the annexation camp, but I would put a little bit star to it, which is that Smotrich actually really cares about annexation. Orit Stuk really cares about annexation, right? They want sovereignty on the West Bank. Ben-Gvir and Lieberman are just kind of racist, meaning they actually do their politics based on Jewish supremacy, regardless of where, regardless of how. And I think it's not surprising then that Ben-Gvir is actually in charge of the police, who functions very much with inside Israel and is really cracking down on political dissent of Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? And Lieberman in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, he ran on a platform of this idea that Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, should actually have to give a loyalty test in order to be citizens of the state, right? So it's not even really necessary. They are pro-annexation, but that's not really exactly what they're working on. But I would put them in the annexation camp for the purpose of understanding this. So we have the status quo camp, we have the annexation camp, which in the end of the day, what's their agreement or disagreement? They both agree that there is a monopoly on legitimate use of force with one state, and that state is Israel, and that state is Jewish, right? There's not equality. It's a Jewish state. And the difference is we should annex or we shouldn't annex. Now, even though, Merav Michaeli, who was the head of the Labor Party up until recently, and is still in the Knesset, to compare her to Smotrich, I mean, it's that's a hard thing to do. And I think that on other issues in terms of, like social issues, women's issues, LGBTQ issues, they're absolutely not the same. But when it comes to the actual base understanding of there can only be control of one state between the river to the sea, that state is Israel and that state is Jewish, they agree. And that's why you often find between the opposition and the coalition, you have annexation parties in both, and you have status quo camps in both. And you often have them, the opposition in a lot of ways right now is mainly opposing Netanyahu. There's a lot of opposition that is character opposition. We don't think Netanyahu should be the prime minister, right? And I agree with them, but that's not a policy opposition. Even yesterday, when the ceasefire came out for Lebanon, the opposition came out very early on to oppose it, much quicker than the coalition did. The coalition voted for it overwhelmingly. And what they're opposing is not totally clear. They have some good points there, right? There's no day after plan for Israeli citizens. There's no budget. Okay, there's no budget. That's a really legit critique. And also, we shouldn't keep bombing and shouldn't keep getting rocket towards us because we don't have a budget, right? Like that's not a way to save lives or think about the future or ensure our security, right? So you made a good point, but that's not a really deep critique on the heart of the issue of should we have a ceasefire or not. So they're quite similar in a lot of ways. And I think this is why it's so hard to come up with a ceasefire in Gaza. It's so hard why it makes a lot of sense as to why annexation is running forward, because while maybe Lapid doesn't want to annex, and he doesn't want to annex, right? But he also doesn't really want an independent Palestinian state next to Israel, right? So, maybe he wants a Palestinian autonomy next to Israel, but doesn't really want a Palestinian state. So how much can you actually oppose what Smotrich is saying when you're kind of offering something that's somewhat similar, but like less than, And then the third camp you have, which is a camp that I believe myself to be a part of and is very important to me, is the equality camp, right? And I separate it from the peace camp because the equality camp is saying there has to be equality between the river to the sea. Palestinians and Israelis need to live in equality. There cannot be military occupation of one group over another, right? Israelis cannot control Palestinians militarily. This is not happening right now, but hypothetically, Palestinians can also not control Israelis militarily, right? There is equality. That equality is at a individual level and at a collective level, right? It can be two states. It could be one state for all its citizens. It could be a confederation with shared power. And you have nuances there, right? You have some parties who are for two states. You have some parties who are for one state. But no one controls anyone else, meaning there is equality. And that camp is small and shrinking. And so Ofer Kasif is the one Jewish politician in the Knesset in the Arab Jewish party Hadash, which is the Communist Party. I think they do amazing work. They're also one of the only parties that still has a really robust youth movement attached to it. So they really do movement work, which is something we don't see a lot in Israeli politics today. It used to be very strong in the labor movement, right? It used to exist quite strongly, and it still exists today with the ultra-Orthodox. They vote based on the movement and their community. But for the most part, a lot of the voting today is much more personality-based, which makes sense because these camps have their differences, but also it's very easy to jump from Gantz to Lapid to Merav Michaeli, and then jump back to Gantz. And this time Gantz will join the coalition, and this time will join the opposition, and the equality camp says no, we actually want equality. We believe in equality. Today, there's three parties that are in the Knesset that are in the equality camp, and it's really gotten smaller again because Meretz is not currently in the Knesset, and to an extent with the new leadership in Meretz, it's not clear that they're in the equality camp, right? I think it's possible that there are still politicians within that party that are genuinely in the equality camp. But during the change government of 2021, there was a year where Netanyahu was not in power, and there was a mixed government of that included groups from the annexation camp and the status quo camp and the equality camp. And the equality camp was kind of often forced to vote against its own interest. And that included MKs from Meretz, who were part of the coalition. And also in that coalition, which was the last coalition before the current coalition, you have the party Ram, which is a Bedouin party that's based in the south. And it's led by Mansour Abbas. And Abbas basically joined the coalition. It's really amazing Israeli politics, because this whole entire change coalition, the idea was, let's get Netanyahu out of power, right? And traditionally in Israeli politics, Arab parties have never sat in a coalition, genuine Arab parties, independent Arab parties. I say this because in the early years of the state, there were satellite parties that were Arab parties, but they were voting with labor, right? Arab parties have never been in the coalition. They supported from outside of the coalition Rabin during the peace process, but they were not inside the coalition. And now the only way the change government could make a coalition was adding in an Arab party. And so they added in Ram. I mean, there's something I think very poetic to it, actually. You can't actually be against the far right unless you're including all of the people, the citizens of Israel. And that includes Arab citizens of Israel. That includes Palestinian citizens of Israel. But, what's important to also say is it's not that Ram was brought in with open arms and everything they wanted went smoothly. The reality is that Abbas and Ram were basically kind of, Abbas made a decision. He said, I'm going to let go of the national question for right now. I'm going to let go for the demand of equality on a national level. And he means that both for Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians under occupation, under 1967 occupation. And he says, however, I want real progress and rights and resources for the community I represent, which is the Bedouin community, who goes through a lot of demolitions in the Negev because the state refuses to recognize their villages, right? And in the end, he did get a little bit of that, but not fully, right? Not in a meaningful way, and not in a way that once the coalition broke apart, that has, it hasn't stayed with Israeli politics, meaning the situation right now for that same exact group of people, for Bedouins in the Negev, is quite bad. There was a village that was demolished in full for the last time, Hiran, about a week and a half ago. And so, he had to sacrifice that position of his. It's not clear that it necessarily worked out. At the same time, the current opposition will never be in the coalition again if they don't bring in Arab parties, right? But it's not that they're Arab, it's that they're demanding equality, right? Because when Meretz demands equality, they also aren't brought in. But when Meretz, right? And so Ofer Kasif, I think, is a great example. And I think Ofer Kasif, he's a Jewish politician inside the Arab Jewish Communist Party. And he was kicked out of Knesset for 6 months because he supported the ICJ case brought by South Africa, and which is that is a position that a member of Knesset or a member of parliament should be able to take in a democratic system, right? Also, Ofer Kasif is not wrong that Israel is not, it's not evaluating itself. It's not investigating itself, right? There are not real metrics in place to investigate what we're doing in Gaza. And there's certainly not public discourse on it. And for that, Ofer Kasif was kicked out. So I think that's very important. I think it's important to call it the equality camp and not the peace camp. Not because the equality camp doesn't want peace. The equality camp absolutely wants peace. But because I think many people would place Lapid in the peace camp, and you can have peace without equality, at least for a while, right? Lapid is now suggesting an end to the war in Gaza, and as part of it, he says the Palestinian Authority will come into Gaza, but they won't have guns. They'll just run it civically, like the civilian aspects of running a government. And in the West Bank, we're going to work with them to reform them so that they deal better with Palestinian terror, right? And I think it's really amazing because the Palestinian Authority is considered to be is so disliked by the Palestinian public because they're considered to work together with the Israeli occupation. The Palestinian Authority has no authority to stop settler violence, to stop settlement expansion and encroachment, to stop soldiers from coming into Jenin whenever they want, right? And not only does Israel not planning on giving them the ability to do that, right, to defend themselves, they're saying, but you also need to kind of go even further when it comes with dealing with Palestinian terror. The reality is, as long as there's occupation, there's going to be terror. There's going to be violence towards the occupation, right? Maybe after the occupation, there'll also be some violence, but I think it will inherently be a different situation, and we can't judge what will be after based on what there is today. And so Lapid is saying, yeah, I want peace, but I don't want to give up control. And the equality camp is saying, yes, we also need to give up some control. We need to share power. That's that's equality, right? So I think it's important to differentiate between those two camps.
Very interesting insight. Thank you for that. Let me briefly show the another important topic. How because my question is how to express solidarity with Jewish people with and at the same time call a spade a spade. For example, what do I mean by that? For example, especially I'm sitting here in Austria and in Germany, it's also very similar. For example, because you mentioned now a lot from the river to the sea. And the court in Germany imposed a fine on a 42-year-old Berlin woman for using the symbol and the phrase, and was punished because she shared the slogan twice on Instagram. And the phrase was "from the river to the sea," and it constitutes a criminal offense. Adding, of course, Palestine will be free, but this is on one hand very ambiguous, because if an Israeli say from the river to the sea, is it also a legal offense or
no?
So
not only is it not a legal offense, Israelis, we only know Israel as being to the river to the sea. Like Israeli 18-year-olds could not tell you where the West Bank is. They could not describe to you what military control is, including soldiers who are carrying out who are soldiers right now in the West Bank, could not tell you the difference between, why are there soldiers in Ramallah and not in Jaffa? I don't know, right? They can't describe the difference of the legal system that's being carried out because that information is constantly being kept from us. And so I think it's really important actually I obviously think it's important to support Jewish people and to support Israelis, but I think we really need, what I'm asking as a Jewish Israeli is that we separate that from the systems of the state that are trying to entrench this idea of zero sum, that what they're actually doing is coming in and trying to have unfiltered power, unfiltered use of violence. I don't think Israel is even unique in that. Right? I mean, again, the definition of a state is its monopoly on the legitimate uses of violence. A lot of states are employing violence right now that they say is legitimate, but that actually is, concentrating power, and that is, harming minorities, or in this case, harming a whole entire group of people who are not citizens of the state, but who are completely affected by the state that they are living under its control. But also
the
I think
concentration of wealth, for example.
Yeah, concentration of wealth, of course, that's, I think, a great example. And here I think what's really interesting is that, for years, there's been the slogan of you can't have democracy with occupation. I think there was this idea once upon a time that, we can occupy and the democracy of Tel Aviv will somehow be felt in the West Bank. But what's really happening is that the non-democracy, the military occupation of Hebron, where, you have a city under military occupation with 230,000 Palestinians who live there, 800 settlers who live there, and like 650 soldiers guarding those settlers at any given moment, and total non-democracy. I mean, Palestinians have total lack of like freedoms in Hebron. And Israeli settlers not only have a lot of privileges, they have basically unfiltered use of violence, right? Even if settlers are being violent towards Palestinians, the role of the Israeli military is to protect those settlers. Well, who lives in Hebron and has for decades? Ben-Gvir. Who is now responsible for the police? Ben-Gvir. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that Ben-Gvir is turning the whole entire police of the state of Israel into the police of Hebron, into the military of Hebron. That's his normal. And as a state, we've allowed that to exist for decades. And we thought it wouldn't spill into us, but that's exactly what it is. The reality of Hebron is spilling into the reality of Israelis. And, I obviously go to a lot of protests. There's a huge protest movement here. Some of it is against the war. A lot of it is also against the current government. The current government is really not in favor right now. And the reality is that there is so much violence happening at these protests, and I am never cease to be amazed, because I've been to a lot of protests in the West Bank, right? And there's a lot of violence. Doesn't matter if you're Israeli. Obviously, the Palestinians get more violence, but also Israelis who are participating in nonviolent protests, we also get violence from the military. And so I'm never ceased to be amazed by both the level of violence that's happening in Tel Aviv. It's not no, I mean, for Israelis, it's honestly at this point almost just as bad as if you're having a protest, if you're joining a protest in Hebron. I mean, maybe with some nuances, but it really has gotten much more violent. But also amazed that your average Israeli who does not spend time in the West Bank, who does not know about the occupation, who does not see this happening kind of in our backyard regularly, are surprised at the level of the violence of the state. And I'm not surprised, because I spend time in Hebron, because I see the violence in Hebron, and I know that the person responsible for the police are responsible for the violence, is now responsible for the person who's responsible for the violence in Hebron is now responsible for the police in Israel. And I say this because you asked how to support Israelis, and I think that's always a difficult question. I do think that there's a way to support both Palestinians and Israelis at the same time, and I think it's supporting the people. It's supporting our right to equality. It's supporting our right to existence. It's supporting our right to self-determination. It's supporting our right to live in justice, in peace, to not have basically state control deciding our lives. Palestinians have that daily, but Jewish Israelis are starting to have that quite a lot. There's a lot of talk now, and I think it's very obvious that the coalition is continuing this war in Gaza. Part of the coalition is continuing it because they want to build settlements in Gaza. But then you have Netanyahu, I think mainly, knows that once the war is over, he'll be gone. And he wants to hold on to his seat. And he is willing to endanger the lives of Israelis daily via police violence, via sending soldiers into places like Gaza, right? I think on average we have something like a soldier a day killed in Gaza since October 7th. That number is incredibly high. People are sending their sons, their daughters, their husbands to this war that has no clear goal except keeping Netanyahu in power and building settlements, right? Maybe you could argue early on of this idea of dismantling Hamas. Now, Hamas cannot be fully dismantled. That's a false notion, and that's setting a stake or setting a goal that's so impossible that it allows continuing the war indefinitely, right? But also, Hamas is much, much weaker than they were in terms of its ability to attack Israelis. Yes, we often talk about the desire or the need to defend Israelis. No, I mean, not no, yes, but to defend Israel. But we also need to remember that the state has a requirement, it has a responsibility to bring home Israelis who are currently in Gaza. They had a responsibility to them on October 7th. on October 6th, and they have a responsibility to them now. And I think one of the things we see abroad is that hostages are used to keep the war going. But if you listen to hostage families, and I can't speak for them, thankfully that's not the situation that I'm in, but I follow hostage families very, very regularly, both in Hebrew and in English, and the message is very clear. We need to make an actual political deal in order to bring the hostages home, and that's the responsibility of the Israeli government, right? Now that's without, of course, getting rid of the responsibility of Hamas, who had no right to take them in the first place, yeah? But also we understand that we're not living in a flawless world, and that Hamas is not going to just hand over the hostages out of the goodness of their heart. Hamas is also an authoritarian power who is using this to maintain control. The government of Israel has a responsibility to return them. And so I think what we need as Israelis from the international community is to call for an end of the war, call for a political agreement, call for a ceasefire, right? And remember again that it's not zero sum, and that upholding the Israeli government and upholding Israelis are two very different things at this moment. And we do need your support, because voices like mine, and I'm really not alone in this, aren't getting through as clearly as voices like the ones who are kind of representing the rights or the interest of the government, not the rights, the interest of the government, right? And so I think that's really important. I think it's horrible. Even in Israel, if someone wrote "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," I don't think they'd get arrested for that. But yeah, I can understand, of course, where Jewish Israelis maybe feel that the idea is that we won't be here, that that's the call. I think that's a very ungenerous reading of that statement, because it's so vague, and because we know that there's not a place between Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. There's not a single place where Palestinians have the same right that Jewish Israelis do, including Arab citizens of Israel. And so I read that as, Palestine will be free as first and foremost, Palestinians will be free. And I think that we have to always care more about the people than the regime that it's representing. And I think there's very much a possibility that in the future the political agreement that comes to is two states, and Israel more or less maintains the legal borders that it has today. But what's more important is that there's two people who both deserve recognition, existence, and supporting us doesn't necessarily mean supporting Netanyahu, but it also doesn't necessarily mean supporting the war in Gaza. We're also suffering from the war in Gaza, not compared to the way the Gazans are, of course, and I can't make that comparison, but in our own way, yeah, we're suffering.
No, absolutely true, yes. You talked about democracy. Let's stay here for a little bit. For example, the ICC published an arrest warrant against Gallant and Netanyahu, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And one can say that this court decision showed the lack of examination of the crimes that Netanyahu and Gallant did, stopping food aid, fuel, and medicine and many other stuff, and the crime against humanity. So one can say, okay, the courts are not functioning very well. Then one can say a few days ago there was a current fight sanction against the oldest Israeli news outlet, Haaretz, yes. So one can say, okay, now the media is also under attack. Then we have also a study showed from forensic architects. The title is A Cartography of Genocide, and they examined through satellite data the sheer destruction of Gaza. And one can also say, okay, ethnic cleansing, or maybe genocide, if you want to call it like this, is also not part of democracy, or how to combine these two things. So if you take the study serious, and if you want to use these words. And my last point, in October the 24th, 2,000 Israeli intellectuals and from the cultural scene have signed a letter published in 11 languages, published also in The Guardian. We Israelis are calling for global pressure on Israel to force an immediate ceasefire. And so the slogan was "Save us from ourselves." So it showed also this the divide between the people and and the state and the regime. So
Yeah.
maybe we can elaborate on this, because democracy, in my opinion, is something like, okay, in the name of the people, or the people, are more or less the same with the regime because they vote and they get to elect and so on and so forth. So maybe it's a
Yeah.
problem with democracy. Maybe we can say it like this. I'm not sure. How would
Yeah.
you describe the problems?
So I think that's a really good question. I'm going to go back to that point that I said before, that there's this kind of common adage in Israel that um, you can't have occupation and democracy together, um, where there is no democracy with occupation. So first of all, I think it's really important to remember that Palestinians who are under 1967 occupation, there's about 5 million of them, have never been under Israeli democracy. They have always been under an Israeli dictatorship, military dictatorship. And I think that's really important because people will often say, well, Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, yeah, sure, I can vote in my part of the system. It's a democracy, and there's certainly democratic levels to it. But for Palestinians, it's not a democracy. For Palestinians who live in Israel, and they make up about 20% of the country, well, it depends. For Palestinians who are living in East Jerusalem, which is part of the 1967 occupation, but Israel unilaterally annexed, Palestinians don't have the right to vote. Palestinians were not given citizenship en masse when Israel annexed. So they are permanent residents, except that their permanent residency is actually not that permanent. And if Palestinians leave East Jerusalem for any amount of time, or even if they just can't prove that they're permanent residents in Jerusalem, they can actually have their residency revoked, and then they have to move to the rest of the West Bank. They can also apply for citizenship, but these numbers, the numbers of applications are very small because Palestinians in East Jerusalem generally don't want to recognize Israel, to recognize Israel as its government. I mean, but also for those who do apply, it is a multi-year process, and more Palestinians have lost residency in East Jerusalem over the years than have gained citizenship, right? So, and then if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, on the surface we have equal rights, but when you kind of dig deeper into it, it's not really that clear cut. For the first 20 years, 18 years of the country, Palestinian citizens of Israel were living under martial law, while Jewish Israelis were under democracy, right? So that's kind of not really a democracy for anyone, because under that same concept, in South Africa, when South Africa had apartheid, the white South Africans were voting. There was a democracy for white South Africans, but the system itself was not democratic, right? And even with martial law, Palestinian citizens of Israel could vote, but the parties that could run, who were Arab for the most part, were satellite parties that had to vote alongside Labor, who was the leading government at the time. So I think it's hard to say completely that Israel's a democracy, and I think that it's I don't want to say that there's no level of democratic reality to it. And again, when we put aside, it's hard for me to put aside the occupation and the reality towards Palestinians, because it really is in the shadow and at the base of almost everything that this country engages in at a political level. But if we put it aside, of course, there's democratic decisions to an extent being made of, we voted for this government that was not led by Netanyahu. It was led by Lapid and Bennett in 2021, and rights for women improved. Rights for LGBT people improved. I don't want to belittle that. I think it's important. But it also was a government that couldn't sustain itself because of the occupation, right? It literally disbanded because there were emergency laws that had to be renewed that kept Israeli settlers in the settlements living under Israeli civilian law, despite them living outside the state of Israel, rather than living under military law. And the coalition, which was a small coalition, no longer had the numbers to vote for it. And the opposition, who was led by the settler movement and by Netanyahu, didn't vote for it because they wanted the coalition to fail. And so the coalition, in the end of the day, broke itself up because then those emergency laws were just immediately elongated, right? No one had to vote for it. And so I think when we think about democracy, you said like, oh, you think of democracy as the will of the people because we're voting, and I think that's one aspect of democracy. And if we go back to like ancient Athens, one man, one vote was a real concept. One man who owned land could vote, and there was no minority rights. There was no rights for other people.
For
Um,
slaves, for women.
yeah, or slaves or women. I mean, and I think that's again, that's already in the sense that who could even vote was just men who owned property, as far as my like history of Athens tells me. But today, when we think of democracy, it has to also include checks and balances. It has to include minority rights. It has to include um, rights to the public from the state. There's been a lot of concentration of power by the state, and even if Israelis, sometimes we are uncritical of that. Like most Israelis are actually probably pro the government disconnecting their relationship with Haaretz. I haven't seen haven't seen any statistics on it, but from my intuition, I think most are pro or neutral about it, right? Even though much more than giving up, it's not about Haaretz. It's not about stopping to support Haaretz. It's about stopping to support, it's about ending the public's right to information, right? To freedom of the press. It's hurting our rights. It's not hurting Haaretz's rights. Haaretz doesn't have rights. It's a company. It's hurting my rights. It's hurting our rights as Israelis. And this is something that a lot of times as Israelis, I think we missed in civics class. We don't, I think a lot of times we don't, it's a concept I talk about a lot. We don't, we kind of miss it. The right to, an inquiry into October 7th, a right to how the army is fighting and how the government is deciding on the war in Gaza right now is also our right to know, right? And I think I'm not surprised, but of course it's a shame that the ICC and the ICJ have to come in and say, you're not investigating yourself, so we're going to investigate you, right? I think this is not only harm towards, Netanyahu and Gallant want to make it about themselves because they have the arrest orders, but who it really affects is Israelis as a whole, that, if the international community does their job, should have real effects on the ability between other countries to want to, get into deals with Israel and to invest in Israel. And in the end of the day, this is going to harm the public. This is going to harm Israelis, Israel's economy. It's going to harm the amount of money we have in our pockets. And I don't think that's, the crux of the issue when we see the ethnic cleansing and the atrocities happening in Gaza. But the fact that the ICJ has to come in and say, we think that there might be a genocide going on, right? And let me say, I don't know what the ICJ is going to decide about, if it's a genocide, but I think there's no question on anyone's mind at this point, on a legal standpoint, that there's ethnic cleansing and there's very serious war crimes happening. Genocide is the hardest war crime to prove. It's a crime against humanity that also happens to be the hardest to prove because of intent. I don't know what they're going to find. I think the finding the links of intent can be very hard legally. I'm not a legal expert, but that's everything I've been told, right? But also our standard should be so much less than genocide, right? Our standard should be not harming innocent people. Our standard should be completely following the letter of the law. I often say, hold Israel to the same standard that I want you to hold any country. And so I think, it's important to remember when we talk about democracy, that democracy today is not just talking about the will of the people. And the will of the people, I'm not against it, but populism can be left-wing and populism can be very right-wing, and populism can often lead to fascism. And it's not in and of itself necessarily the best thing, right? And especially because you're always going to have a majority. You're always going to have some group that is the majority, or and so either minority rights, or in this case, Palestinians aren't even really a minority. I mean there are people being denied self-determination, but still are not going to be recognized. Or you have a lot of countries in which the minority has power, and then that inherently makes it undemocratic over time if they're trying to hold on to that power, because they're a minority and they know they won't get it through votes, right? And so this is why it's so important that countries have that systems, that democratic systems have checks and balances as well. And this is what right now the right-wing Israeli government, and has been for a few years, is systematically getting rid of, right? And so I used to think democracy was that it existed or it doesn't exist. I don't really think that anymore in my 30s. I've, spent a lot of time doing this work, and I think there's clearly a scale. Some places are more democratic, some places are less democratic, but Israel is really heading down a non-democratic path, even for Jewish Israelis, right? Or even for Israelis. We'll include, if you're an Israeli citizen, including for Israelis.
Yeah, sounds terrible, but and horrible. It's also in Europe, so so it's everywhere
honestly,
with Trump and now the
yeah,
so.
Western democracies have not really withstood. At this moment, it seems that Western democracies have not really withstood the test of time, and they haven't really withstood the test of kind of constantly trying to push the democratic values. You have to be really vigilant, and Western democracies have shown that they've actually been way too lenient with authoritarianism.
And also here comes when talking about Western, values, one have to say that there are contradictions or ambiguities, or maybe one can say hypocrisy, because everybody accepts the International Criminal Court of Justice saying that Putin is a war criminal, but Western democracies are feeling unease or not by calling Netanyahu a war criminal. So
Right.
and the global south is looking at us. The global south is seeing, if you watch carefully the UN General Assembly, the voting system, the votings. If you hear the speeches of Malaysian president, Indonesian president, Brazilian president, and many other from the global south, you hear this. They are saying, "Hey, you Western guys, you are." Yeah, hypocritical. This comes also into play.
And I think there's a lot to be said about that. I think we really do see a double standard, and it's not the issue that I focus most of my time on, but I think there's no question that it always amazes me, and I say this as someone who I love my society, and I want us to live here a good future. And also, it's really surprising that there's an assumption, for example, of Israeli democracy, and therefore nothing that the Israeli government can do can prove otherwise. And I think you see that hypocrisy a lot. I think that's like a really big critique of the global south, of we're not being seen, we're not being considered, this isn't really a democracy towards us. The way that these states were set up did not include us. They did not include our right to self-determination. And I think that's something that we're kind of dealing with. And if I may say, I think that's kind of why the issue of the occupation is so popular. I mean, on one hand, we're seeing the daily violence in Gaza, and I think that you have to it's hard to not be affected by that. But I also think that we're seeing this kind of issue of it's on one hand, Israel was established by Jewish people, a lot who were fleeing the Holocaust, right? There was a real refugee issue. And on the other hand, it was established by, European Jewish leaders who gained their tools from other European countries. And it was supported by other European countries. And I think this is a lot why people talk about settler colonialism, and the thing about settler colonialism, it doesn't mean that there's not a connection to the country. The opposite, it means that this is our home. We don't have anywhere else to go, right? But the issue is not that we're here. The issue is the state structures that were set up to prefer one group over another. But I think why it's so popular to talk about, or as an issue of our time. I remember when I was in high school, like Tibet was the issue, right? You have and I think before that South Africa was an issue. I think it's because it's not a localized issue. It actually involves a lot of different powers, a lot of different countries. I think that it's often being seen as this kind of fight between the global north and the global south. And and that's why there are so many perspectives and so much anger on this issue. The actual violence that's happening is also enough to bring out the anger of people, and it should bring out the anger of people. But there's a lot of violence happening in a lot of places around the world. I'm not sure that the Rwandan genocide brought out this level of anger on a global scale. Now, part of it is that we didn't have smartphones at the time, right? But I think part of it was the structures that were used to set up the state are similar structures that were used in a lot of places. And so I think a lot of the questions are also people, knowingly or not knowing, reflecting back on situations in other places, in other areas in the world. And for European countries who have stayed put, but European countries participated in a lot of the setting up of these countries. And therefore, it really is a global conversation.
Absolutely, yes. For all those who are curious what the national state of Israel has to do with a chocolate ice cream machine, please subscribe to Becca's YouTube channel. Becca called Becca Explains the Occupation. And also I would like to mention that one can book Becca for a lecture, for a tour, for a webinar. It is very useful for all people, especially journalists, scientists, NGOs, firms who want to invest in Israel, politicians, and many others. I totally recommend booking Becca. With these words, Becca, I want to thank you a lot for your time, for your insights, and that you opened your heart and your mind for this channel and for our audience. I thank you very lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.